In order to go along with the theme of this conference, traversing the Mormon landscape, we must ask a fundamental question. What is a temple? Any discussion of the Mormon landscape must involve the built environment. So in this presentation, we're going to be looking at a preliminary assessment of both Mormon and non-Mormon architectural perceptions of what a temple is or should be, and their implications for designers and architects. When we think about Mormonism, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it has been categorized as one of the fastest growing Christian faiths in the world. In 2009, the church was en route to build more square footage that year than Walmart. One historian has called it a truly American story associated with the molding of a physical environment. On the other hand, one theologian has characterized Mormonism as halfway between monastery and factory. But ultimately, when we think about the Mormon landscape, it is comprised of sacred spaces known as temples. Temples in and of themselves serve as embodied symbols of religio-cultural identity. And as we look at the growth trends for church membership in a whole, compared with the number of temple building projects over the past 200 years, it has been fairly proportionate with the membership growth, as you can see in this graph here. So how do we begin to assess architectural perceptions? First, what is a temple? To a Mormon and to a non-Mormon. How does the temple act as a symbol of faith? What messages are conveyed by its architecture? And for those designers who work on these types of projects, what architectural qualities are important for a temple? And can religious persuasion and/or one's encounters with sacred spaces affect one's perception of an ideal temple? And lastly, how do we empirically map this phenomenon? One method that has come to my attention is the work of Mircea Eliade and Lindsay Jones. Both are comparative historians of religion and, not coincidentally, editors of the Encyclopedia of Religion. Lindsay Jones builds off Eliade's work in how one looks at and interprets sacred architecture. In particularly, in his 2-volume series entitled The Hermeneutics of Sacred Architecture, Lindsay Jones provides a conceptual model whereby individuals can interpret sacred architecture, ritual, and experience. It's broken up into various categories. And so, taking this existing framework, I use this in the form of survey research. Ultimately, when we ask the question, what is a temple? We're looking at people's perceptions, their beliefs, and really kind of that subjective quality. And we're looking at various categories that have been mapped objectively in the built environment, categories of sacred architecture from around the world, known as morphology. So in this study, I have taken a theoretical framework by Lindsay Jones and all of his categories of sacred architecture, and I have formulated them into survey questions. In conducting a survey, then the results of this could then be applied to the design world or the design of new spaces. Before we begin, however, Lindsay Jones defines what he calls a ritual architectural event with several items. The first is the built form, the building itself, the architecture. The next aspect is the ceremonial occasion that brings people together, the ritual and religion. Of course, then we have participants who come, people who come with their expectations, their beliefs, their traditions, ultimately derived from their culture or their religion. Putting those three together, the built form, a ceremonial occasion, and one's expectations and beliefs, oftentimes the result is a transformative event, an experience that leads itself to beauty, to transcendence, to awe, to peace, etc. So what we're looking at here is taking a preliminary assessment, a survey, and seeing what are the perceptions of different religious groups and how that could be used then for the designers, who are the spatial choreographers. Then we have the religious specialists, or better known as the ritual choreographers. And then of course the participants, the actors and the audiences themselves, who will be coming to these occasions. But ultimately, what is achieved from this experience is what affects human understanding. So, the survey methodology for this study was conducted via the internet and in paper format. Survey responses were collected for 1 month. There was 8 questions about demographics, 34 questions about the temple and its morphology, and Jones's definitions in general and the terminology that he used was simplified to engage a larger audience. In the end, over 100 survey responses were received. So let's look at the demographics. For the most part, gender was split down the line. We had fairly even distribution of amongst the age groups. Education levels differed widely, with those with some college or beyond were the largest group. Occupations differed largely as well. But when we look at religion, there was a large percentage, 61% in fact, in the other Christian category. But when we really break it down, that other group was particularly Latter-day Saints. So, dissecting the information in this format, you had about 61% of participants who were Mormon and 39% who were non-Mormon. So here are the results, comparing the data based on the two religions. First, however, when we look at what were the Mormon perceptions of a temple, so anything beyond and above 66% was deemed to be a high result. Using that method, there was a high receptivity to pretty much all of the questions. 82% of them were believed by Mormons to be true. When we look at non-Mormon perceptions using the same rule, it drops significantly. Only 65% of all of the questions were agreed to. So what about the similarities and the differences between the groups? Well, the major similarities between Mormons and non-Mormons occurred for 28 of the 34 categories, with only 6 categories including major differences. So, in order to see if religion actually played a factor in the way someone responded to a question, we did several statistical tests to see if there was the relationship. We used Fisher's exact test of association, and in doing so, 13 categories had significantly statistical relationships. Using these 13 categories, we've looked at them and their relationship to Mormons and non-Mormons, and also examples of how architecture begins to do some of the things and reinforce some of these beliefs. So in order to determine the strength of the relationship after this first statistical test, we perform the odds ratio, which tell us what are the odds, for example, of a Mormon agreeing to this statement than a non-Mormon. In general, anything greater than 1 is associated with one being Mormon and having a higher odds of an outcome. So starting at the very beginning, the resting place of the dead. This could be defined as architectural configurations that are designed for the assiduous treatment and accommodation of the physical bodily remains of the dead or undead. So let's look at Judaism, specifically at Jerusalem. In general, the dead were viewed as impure or profane. All burials, tombs, graves, etc. were on the outskirts of the city, except there is the belief that potentially some of the kings may have been buried on the Temple Mount. But in general, even today, we could see that graves surrounded the perimeter walls to all of the cardinal directions. Specifically, looking at the Mount of Olives on the east side of the Temple Mount, you have burials there dating back from the 8th century BC up into the present. But going back to ancient Israel and the practices, the blood of the temple sacrifices drained into this valley on the east side, known as the Kidron Valley. It became known as the place of death and impurity because of this. We also have the practice of rock-cut tombs as part of family burials. But what about in Mormonism? Few Mormons probably are aware that in Nauvoo, on the southeast corner, there was a plan for what is known as the tomb of Joseph. One specific non-Mormon of the time wrote in his journal, "When the Mormons began to rear their gorgeous temple, 2 tombs of hewn stone were built on the west side of the edifice, one for Joseph Smith and the other for Sidney Rigdon." Archaeologists have now been able to discover that it was actually on the southeast side of the temple. Another connection to the grave or the bodily remains of individuals and of a final resting place is that some Latter-day Saint temples are built adjacent to or near cemeteries. This, in particularly at Kirtland, Manti, and Winter Quarters, helps reinforce the idea of vicarious work for one's ancestors and for the dead. So, what was the survey response? Actually, Mormons were very few in number. Only 12% agreed that the temple was a resting place for the dead, with 43% of non-Mormons agreeing such. And so the odd ratio here was in favor of non-Latter-day Saints, who were 7 times more likely to agree with this statement than the Mormon population. Another category is Imago Mundi, which is essentially architectural expressions of cosmogrammatic ordering that are conceived as downsized replicas of the universe. In the Hindu tradition, you have sacred geometric diagrams that are thought of as, which is used in the temple floor plan, and believed to be a microscopic image of the universe. There's also the idea that energy is at the center, or God is at the center, and the energy flows outward from this point. The cosmic man also actually fits within this geometrical pattern, with the navel being at the center. So, architecturally, the center of the temple is the most sacred part, and it's articulated formally with a pyramidal tower. In Latter-day Saint temples, we have this notion of Imago Mundi on several different levels. Take, for instance, the Alberta, Canada temple. The celestial room itself is at the center of the temple and is articulated by its pyramidal tower. This reinforces several scriptural verses from Latter-day Saint canon, such as the idea that light and power proceeds forth from the presence of God at the center to then feel the immensity of space. Also, the idea that God sits on his throne in the bosom of eternity, or in the midst or middle of all things. Another way that Imago Mundi is portrayed is in the facades of several temples. So reinforcing degrees of glory, but also the idea of the Earth's progression through space and time, as well as the Godhead. So in and of itself, the facade then, illustrated by earthstones, moonstones, sunstones, etc., demonstrates how the temple becomes a scale model of the universe. There's these macro, micro parallels. So when asked if a temple was a miniature model of the universe, 37% of Latter-day Saints agreed that this was the case, with only 18% of non-Mormons. So the Mormons were actually 3.8 times more likely to agree with this statement than the rest of those participating. The next category is sacred episodes of history, which is really when architecture commemorates mythical historical episodes or occurrences. In kind of the Judeo-Christian tradition, you have various episodes of sacred history, starting in the cosmogonic primordial era, the paradisal world of Eden, etc. But all of these are tied to spaces within the architectural configurations, and there's quite a few similarities between the two. When we look at the Latter-day Saint tradition, you find the same example in a lot of early Mormon temples. One of the sacred rites, known as the endowment, is a ritual drama that occurs, well, in these early temples in 5 different rooms. So patrons experience a room-to-room movement, and each of these rooms pertains to a specific episode of sacred history. So it's not surprising then, when asked if the architecture of a temple honors sacred events in history, 88% of Latter-day Saints agreed, with only 55% of non-Mormons agreeing. So Mormons were 5 times more likely to agree with this statement. Next we have axis mundi, which is really the architectural expression of a vertical axis between worlds and or the horizontal symbolism of a cosmic center. So in the Catholic tradition, such as in San Miniato al Monte, the basilica in Florence, built in the 12th century, we have the sanctuary, or the apse space, symbolizing heaven, located directly above the crypt for the dead. A more contemporary example does the same thing. In San Francisco, the Cathedral of Christ the Light, you have the high altar directly above the mausoleum, and the connection between the two was made fairly evident with the use of translucent glazing above the or at the altar. In the Latter-day Saint tradition, we have a similar method of showing this vertical axis. So in the Mesa, Arizona temple, for example, you have the celestial room representing the heavenly realm, God's presence, located directly above the baptismal font for the dead. So what about the horizontal symbolism of the center? In Judaism, we see that Jerusalem, in many medieval maps as well as renditions of the city, were believed that Jerusalem was indeed the center of the world, and then at the center of its city was the temple. So early Mormon town planning did a similar method. The temple was at the 00 marker, the sacred center of the city, and everything, all streets and addresses, were taken from this point. So whether you're east, north, south, or west, you always knew what your coordinates were in regards to the temple. So when asked if a temple's location is a sacred gathering place or axis, 91% of Latter-day Saints agreed, with 77% of non-Mormons agreeing. So the Mormon vote was 5 times more likely in this case. Archetype is our next category, which involves imitations of celestial precedents or archetypes themselves. In Judaism, you have Moses, who was on Mount Sinai, and the mountain itself became the prototype by using sacred geography, kind of a tripartite gradations of holiness, which was then continued over into the Mosaic tabernacle, the portable sacred space, and then doubled in size after that in the permanent sacred space of the Jerusalem temple. In Mormonism, we have this similar precedent, how Kirtland influenced Nauvoo and Nauvoo influenced the design for Salt Lake. But in each case, as Brigham Young says, Joseph not only received revelation and commandment to build a temple, but he received a pattern also, as did Moses for the tabernacle and Solomon for his temple. So, does temple architecture copy a heavenly pattern or design? 88% of Latter-day Saints agreed that this was the case, with the non-Mormon response cut in half. This made Latter-day Saints 16 times more likely to agree with the archetype category. The next and closely related is the concept of a revealed plan, when architecture really conforms to axiomatic stipulations that are considered to have been delivered by divine revelation or decree. So in Judaism, as we've already seen, the idea with Moses and the pattern that he received, he was instructed specifically to make the tabernacle after the pattern that was shown to him in the mount. In the Kirtland Temple, God revealed to Joseph Smith and said, "Let the house be built not after the manner of the world, let it be built after the manner which I shall show unto 3 of you." So in this instance, this was later fulfilled and revealed in vision to the first presidency of the church. So, when asked if an architect of a temple uses a revealed plan or measurements from God, surprisingly, the Latter-day Saint vote dipped significantly. Only 69% agreed with this statement. The non-Mormon response, however, dipped significantly to 16%, making Latter-day Saints 17 times more likely to agree with their architecture being in conformity to a revealed plan than the non-Latter-day Saint. Next, we have COSMOGONY, which is when ritual architecture commemorates creation stories or myths. In the Hindu tradition, we have an example on a macro-urban scale found in Angkor Wat, where the moat surrounds this large architectural complex, but it reinforces the Southeast Asian creation story, the idea that the cosmic sea of milk was churned by the gods, and this brought the universe into being. Now, zooming down to a micro scale in the Latter-day Saint tradition, the endowment rooms, where the presentation is viewed, often have this idea of cosmogony, specifically the creation room, where you have murals depicting various phases of the Earth's creation, similar to the biblical account. Other temples, like that in Los Angeles, California, also depict this symbolism with their murals of light and darkness, but this room in particular is in the shape of a Vesica Pisces, or the almond, reinforcing the symbolism of creation in and of itself. Having this in mind, and when asked if the design of a temple could honor the creation of heaven and earth, 99% of Latter-day Saints agreed, with 82%, a very similar high percentage, of the non-Mormon. Mormons, however, were 18 times more likely to agree in this case than the non-Mormon population. The next category is a sanctified refuge, where the building's design is meant to restrict access, to guard the integrity of the architectural space and or its ritual proceedings. In Judaism, we have this example fairly clearly outlined, with its multiple courts and walls to restrict access and promote solitude, kind of the gradations of holiness, but also being on a mountaintop and the pilgrimage experience of ascent caused it to encourage exclusivity to some extent by its inaccessibility. In the Latter-day Saint tradition, we find a similar technique. Temple sites are often located on elevated terrain. They're surrounded by perimeter fences, and platforms, all in an attempt to provide an experience of ascent, but also to help protect the sanctity of this structure. Moving to the interior, you have a similar notion of a sanctified refuge. The first thing one encounters when one enters the main doors of a temple is known as the recommend desk. It acts as a physical visual gate where only the worthy or initiated are able to enter. But within the temple itself, there's a hierarchy of ritual spaces. The font's typically placed in the lowest point of the temple, with sealing rooms in the highest portion. But in the endowment, which we talked about earlier, there is a prescribed spatial sequence with a series of thresholds that must be passed in order to enter the most sacred place, known as the celestial room. Thus, when asked if a temple restricts its access in order to help keep it separate and sacred, 99% of Latter-day Saints agreed that this was the case. The non-Mormon vote was only 61%, making Mormons 22 times more likely to agree that this was the case. A significant finding. Moving on, we have the category of hierophany, which is when architecture expresses when the sacred has made itself manifest, or there's an earthly manifestation of the sacred in a specific place. Specifically, we have this example in the various Abrahamic traditions. Specifically, Abraham himself was going to offer Isaac on Mount Moriah, which later became the Temple Mount. But there was an angelic visit by an angel telling him to not sacrifice his son. When King Solomon dedicated the temple on this same mount, God's presence filled the edifice. Muhammad, at this same location, ascended into heaven in a vision known as the Night Journey, and is now marked by the Dome of the Rock. We have a couple instances of this phenomenon in the Mormon temples. For example, the Palmyra temple site is strategically located near the sacred grove, where a theophany occurred to Joseph Smith. The Manti temple site was believed to have been dedicated by the ancient Book of Mormon prophet Moroni, and the St. George temple was believed to have been dedicated by Nephites, also ancient American inhabitants. So when asked if a temple represented sacredness, 100% of Latter-day Saints agreed, with 84% of non-Mormons agreeing. This finding made Latter-day Saints 25 times more likely to agree with the statement than the non-Mormon population. Another category is known as kind of a place of negotiation, where architecture is used in a propitiatory way through various rituals. In the Catholic tradition, we have several instances of this, specifically some woodcuts and some medallions from the 16th and 17th century, where you have depictions of God as kind of the gatekeeper, with the bishop bringing the penitent or the members of the church to that portal and then presenting them to God. So it was a place of negotiation where one sought for forgiveness of sins, in a sense. You also have this idea conveyed in mosaics in Ravenna, as well as some woodcuts. And early on, before confession booths were actually created, confession took place at the rood screen, or the veil within the church, where one had a conversation with the priest representing God. So this idea of negotiation. In Mormon temples, you have similar practices where prayer, covenants, promises, contracts are made at altars. There's also a symbolic interaction at the veil, and the celestial room acts as a place of prayer, contemplation, where one, in essence, pleads and asks, and to some extent negotiates with God for blessings and divine assistance. So 100% of Latter-day Saints agreed that a temple was a place of prayer and or negotiation with God, with 80% of non-Mormons agreeing that this was the case as well. Mormons were 27 times more likely then, in this case, to agree with the statement. Architectural constructions or deconstruction processes can in and of themselves be conceived as propitiatory ritual. In the Shinto religion, the Ishigran Shrine in Japan is periodically destroyed and then reconstructed. This kind of periodic dismantling and erecting of the new shrine on an adjacent site is an important part of the construction process. There's this idea that there's a ceremonial renewal every 20 years. So the next deconstruction is going to occur in the year 2033. Latter-day Saint construction processes have other similar propitiatory significance. The groundbreaking or site dedication of the location for a future temple, the laying of the cornerstones, the placing of the Angel Moroni statue, not necessarily a ceremonial event or process, but oftentimes large congregations gather for this ritual lifting of the statue. There's also the capstone or the final cornerstone ceremony, often conducted by the first presidency of the church, the temple's actual dedication, and as well as kind of the periodic remodeling of a building, bringing it up to speed, another way of dedicating one's time, talents, and means to God. And so the building in and of itself serves as an offering to God. So, is the temple building and its construction meant to please God? 100% of Latter-day Saints agreed, with 59% of non-Mormons agreeing. This was 52 times higher than the non-Mormon population. Transmutation of the dead. This is one that's probably not as familiar to many, but it's when architectural configurations can serve as the actual embodiment, re-actualization, or transmutation of the dead. Let's look at a few examples. Going back to ancient Egyptian religion and temples and pyramids, light, physical light, was believed to be the source of power and life. The rays of sunlight, when they first touched the mountaintop, it was believed that this brought life and power into the dark grave and the underworld of the sleeping dead beneath the mountain. And specifically, apertures and windows in temples were designed to allow light to shine onto the dead or undead body to preserve it from decay. Pyramids also acted as kind of the primordial mountain, and it was a sign of the triumph over death. Why was all of this done? the architecture really embodied the hope that Pharaoh would participate in the resurrection of the sun god and come back to life. Latter-day Saints are equally concerned with the dead and the realm of the dead, known as the spirit world. And this is why one of the main reasons for constructing temples, specifically their baptismal fonts for the dead. It was instructed to them by God to place it in a place underneath, where the living are wont to assemble in order to reinforce the realm of the dead, kind of a similitude of the grave. So when asked if a temple could help the dead or deceased ancestors to progress in the afterlife, 97% of Latter-day Saints agreed, with a very small percentage, 32%, of non-Mormons agreeing that this was the case and function of a temple. This made Latter-day Saints 56 times more likely to agree with this statement than the others. And lastly, we have how architecture can be conceived as the abode, residence, or house of a deity or a divine presence. Going back to the Hindu tradition, the temple was typically built as a replica of the mythological mountain home of the gods. The temple is, to some extent, the temporary abode of the gods, but it's still located in the world of man. So there's always this potential for the divine to manifest itself, but for the most part, it happens occasionally. One could say a similar thing of Latter-day Saint temples. Most Latter-day Saint temples have a plaque on them designating them as the house of the Lord, with also the inscription holiness to the Lord. Part of this is derived from scriptural mandates instructing the saints to establish a house, even a house of God. God promises that his presence shall be there. He will come into it, and all the pure in heart shall come into it and shall see God. But the idea of the mountain is also there, similar to Hinduism, where the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains. Also a reason why Latter-day Saint temples are built on elevated sites. So, when asked if temples are the home or house of God, it is not surprising, therefore, that 100% of all participants agreed that this was the case, with non-Mormons only half of which, 45%, agreed. This had the highest odds ratio, making Latter-day Saints nearly 150 times more likely to agree that temples were the home or house of God. So what are the conclusions? Let's look at some of the limitations, design opportunities, and future research. So, based on our findings, when asked what is a Mormon temple, we can respond and say, a Mormon temple is a house of God. It is a place that helps the dead to progress in the afterlife. It's built as an offering, meant to please God. It's a place of prayer and negotiation with God. It's a place representing sacredness. It specifically restricts its access to help keep it separate and sacred. It is designed to honor the creation and based on a revealed plan. And oftentimes, this revealed plan is a copy of the heavenly pattern or design. The temple is a sacred gathering place or access between worlds. It's designed to honor sacred events, and and it can be conceived as a miniature model of the universe. But for the most part, the temple is not a direct burial or resting place for the dead, although some instances indicate this adjacency. So, what are the limitations of the study? As any study comes with its limitations. First and foremost, there's a bias towards a belief that a building can be sacred and have meaning. 96% of participants agreed. The other limitation is that it's a non-probability sample. As we noted, this is a preliminary assessment, so it is non-scientific, and we can't infer the findings to the greater population, especially since it was conducted online, by paper, for only 1 month, etc. So, in and of itself, it is a pilot study with a small proportion of respondents. But what are the design opportunities? First, this survey research provides designers with a holistic approach to improve the interconnectivity between architecture, ritual, culture, religion, and experience. It's a method for assessing perceptions, expectations, and beliefs. And it allows us to have kind of a design process that is informed by survey findings. So, when we think of the ritual architectural design process, right, we have the spatial choreographers, the built form, the ritual choreographers, the ceremonies or rituals, and the people who come to it. And by conducting a survey in this manner, it allows the findings to inform the design, which then can be reevaluated once the project is completed in a post-occupancy evaluation to see what is the difference in human understanding. Of course, there are opportunities for future research. Large-scale survey would be needed to make broader inferences to the Latter-day Saint population. But there's also taking this kind of theoretical survey research into practice, where the survey data can actually inform design. But researchers, more broadly speaking, historians, theologians, etc., could further explore the qualities of Latter-day Saint temples based on these initial survey findings. So, in conclusion, what messages are conveyed through the architecture of the temple, specifically the Latter-day Saint temple? As Gordon B. Hinckley expressed, he said that Mormonism, the temple and its ordinances are one of the most profound expressions of Latter-day Saint theology. So I leave you with that, and hopefully this presentation has given you a better understanding of the architectural perceptions of both Mormons and non-Mormons, and how that is influenced by the built landscape. Thank you.